Transactions on the global carbon markets totaled 850.
One group is here to fix it, giant corporations. Many are now claiming that they're
set to reach their ambitious climate pledges.
Apple is going carbon neutral.
A market-based system that aims to provide economic incentives for countries and businesses.
We are facing a global crisis, and yet the solutions being offered are still on the same exploitative system, top-down. I'm Joan Carling. I am a Kankanaey. That's my tribal group from the Philippines, from the north of the Philippines. I come from the mountain. That's why we are called Igorot, meaning people of the mountain.
Joan Carling is a prominent Kankanaey activist, an indigenous group from what is now the Philippines. She has dedicated her life to advocating for the rights of indigenous peoples, environmental conservation, and sustainable development worldwide. When Joan Carling talks about sustainability, she reveals its complexity. She says it's not just about the environment. It's also about politics, human rights, non-human rights, and the worrying trend of green colonialism.
Everything is converted into business, and that is why it is unsustainable.
Joan Carling is deeply troubled by green colonialism. By green colonialism, she refers to a group of new economic projects that argue that they are protecting the environment and creating sustainable profit, when, in reality, what they are doing is exploiting, once again, indigenous peoples and their territories. It is something similar to greenwashing, in how they based exploitation on an environmental argument, but, in this case, through a colonial project. This often prioritizes profit and corporate benefits over genuine conservation efforts and the welfare of communities.
What is the problem when things turn into business? It's only a few taking decisions on how resources are going to be used, and it's only few benefiting from it.
Joan argues that when making money is the end goal, all the connections necessary to make something sustainable are ignored. The needs of the land, the people, the non-humans who inhabit it are all ignored, and thus the connection, the reciprocal relations are broken.
Indigenous peoples have been saying that all along, that we cannot abuse nature because we actually need to have a reciprocal relations and live in harmony with nature if we want future generations to survive. And it's scientifically proven that the reason why we're having this crisis, this climate crisis, is because of industrialization, because of business that only benefits the few and driving majority to poverty and marginalization.
The question is, how do we fight against a global system that often treats sustainability and the future of our planet as just another way to make money? The people of the other side of the river. This is what some indigenous peoples call those of us who live in cities, disconnected from nature, consuming, discarding, extracting. We have spent too many years with our backs to the river, and now is the time to change that. Indigenous peoples in different parts of the world know how to coexist with nature, protect planet Earth, and guarantee human and non-human life. In this podcast series, you will learn from multiple indigenous leaders who live on the front lines of the global climate crisis. Here, they share their life experiences, knowledge, and urgent advice. They are the ones who are leading the path to a possible future. It's time to listen to them It's time to cross the river. Crossing the River is a podcast from More Than Human Life Project Moth, based at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU School of Law, and 070 Podcast. Joan's path in activism began in the early 80s when she was a student at the University of the Philippines.
We are called the martial law kids because we were growing up at the time of martial law in the Philippines. And so at the beginning, I thought that was pretty normal, that, things are regulated.
Joan grew up under the Ferdinand Marcos dictatorship that ruled the Philippines from 1965 to 1986. Marcos is remembered for his corruption, extravagance, and brutality. And so Joan grew up in a country where martial law was declared in 1972 and lasted 14 years.
I remember my brothers having to cut their hair. They cannot wear any kind of military attire, and there were curfews. I thought that was normal.
14 years of no civil liberties, limited freedom of press, and where many opposition leaders were arrested. It was a time where the military grew and foreign education was blocked. But this is how Joan grew up, and so she thought it was normal, until she realized it wasn't.
But then it turned out when I was in college that it's actually a repressive system to control. It's a martial law, and it's where the government and the military is exercising control over people's activities, right? And that was when I learned about the exploitation and oppression. For example, strikes are not allowed, students are not allowed to form organizations. So I grew up in that atmosphere. So then that's the reason why I became an activist.
At that time, the Marcos regime promoted the construction of hydropower dams on the Chico River. The Chico River flows through lush tropical mountains, harboring unique wildlife and serving as the vital lifeline for indigenous communities in the Cordillera region of the Philippines. Revered as the lifeblood of these communities, it holds profound cultural significance. The dam project proposed by the Marcos regime threatened to displace over 100,000 people from the indigenous Kalinga towns. The Kankanaey, Joan's community, joined the Kalinga communities to resist the construction of the Chico River Dam. There, Joan witnessed firsthand how extractive industries could deeply affect her homeland and the wider impact on indigenous lands and peoples. Many of those opposed to the dams were jailed, and Kankanaey Dulag, a Kalinga tribal leader, was assassinated. After attending the memorial of the late chieftain, she decided to spend time in the Kalinga tribal area to join the struggle.
Indigenous communities protested and defended their land, and that's actually the start of the indigenous peoples movement in the region, the Cordillera region where I come from, and also the larger indigenous movement in the country. One that has ignited a strong solidarity amongst indigenous peoples in the Philippines and outside is the opposition to the Chico dams.
The resistance was strong, staging protests in both the Cordillera and Manila, the capital of the Philippines, sending delegations to negotiate with Marcos, and resorting to acts of sabotage and violence against the construction sites along the river. Despite facing immense challenges, the community sustained their resistance for over a decade. Ultimately, the Chico River Dam project never materialized, in part thanks to their resistance. And while this is one of the landmark case studies when it comes to understanding ancestral domains in the Philippines, the indigenous peoples of the land are still threatened by new dam projects proposed by the government. The resistance against the Chico River Dam project played a strong influence on Joan's activism. Here, she learned one of the key principles in her work. Indigenous peoples are tied to the land. They cannot be disconnected.
In our language, we refer to ibontok, Kankanaey. That means I come from that land. We identify with our territory. Our identity is tied up to our territory. So if we are evicted, then we lose that identity. And that is a human rights issue. That is an issue of social justice. That is an issue of discrimination, right? And that's also why I got into this work as a lifetime commitment, because for me, nobody should be discriminated.
With Joan Carling, who's the Secretary General for the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact.
You better rethink your investment, because tyranny should not be supported. To achieve the SDGs on the basis of equality, equity, accountability, cultural diversity, non-discrimination, and respect for human rights. Thank you, Madam Chair.
In the past 30 years, Joan has occupied many leadership positions.
Are representing the UN Indigenous Peoples Majors Group for the SDGs. Can you explain to people?
She was the chair of the militant Cordillera Peoples Alliance, Secretary General of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact.
My guest today is Joan Carling. Ms. Joan Carling from the Cordillera in the Philippines.
She was appointed an indigenous expert by the UN Economic and Social Council and was a member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues.
Local communities and small farmers as key actors in sustainable landscape management.
However, her prominent positions have also made her a target of threats. In March of 2018, Joan woke up to the news that the government of the Philippines, led by the extremist Rodrigo Duterte, had accused her of being a terrorist.
For one, I'm not a terrorist, and I'm proud to be.
She was among the list of 600 individuals who were considered terrorists for allegedly being members of the Communist Party of the Philippines. That same year, she won the Champions of the Earth Award from the United Nations.
Many countries still do not legally recognize the collective rights of indigenous peoples, and majority are not legally recognized. They are invisible. They are not protected by law. We are criminalized.
Joan found herself in exile, fearing to return home. Yet this only strengthened her resolve and commitment to her principles. In response, she co-founded the nonprofit Indigenous Peoples Rights International in 2019. Their aim is to combat the criminalization and violence targeting indigenous leaders and serve as a global platform for advocacy and collaboration.
Because we share the same rights, and our collective rights are being violated by almost the same actors: businesses, states, corporations, investors, military. So that's why we need first to strengthen ourselves, build the collaboration, do work at the local, regional, global, and levels.
Joan knows that working together through organization and diligent action is the only way to pressure governments and corporations. This is her strategy to push for real legal solutions and public policies that go beyond treaties and agreements that most of the time aren't respected.
Government don't give a shit. But once you bring it at the international level, when they are shamed, and other governments start raising their concern, and they can actually use the leverage of the investment they're making, then they listen.
Joan believes in the importance of global collaboration among indigenous communities. She argues for their inclusion in decision-making processes due to their proven ability to live harmoniously with nature.
If we want to protect nature for people, then indigenous peoples will have to play a central role. because it is with indigenous people's systems of resource management. It is the principles of solidarity, of cooperation, the principles of holding the common good or upholding the common good rather than selfish interest.
Now, let's go back to the start, to what Joan calls green colonization. When it comes to facing the global climate crisis, Joan believes that one of the biggest issues we face is the fact that business is always prioritized. She said it at the beginning of the episode. The priority is always profit, not sustainability or human rights. An example of that are carbon credits.
Why do we still continue to find solutions in a business way? Why are we talking about carbon market, carbon trading, when the issue is how do we now dramatically reduce carbon emission and increase carbon sequestration? And that is within a balance of nature, right? That we need to keep fossil on the ground.
A carbon credit symbolizes the removal of 1 ton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. For instance, if a company emits 1,000 tons of carbon, they would buy 1,000 carbon credits from a carbon offset project, like a tree planting project. Joan has a strong position against carbon credits. One of the ways industries and activists have proposed that the use of fossil fuels can be regulated.
It's again using the same mold that you're operating again as a business, because you're putting commercial value to something, because the ultimate goal is to reduce carbon. So we need to account where is carbon being emitted and how do we reduce that. That should be the approach. We know that it's fossil fuel. Burning of fossil fuel is a major. So we need to cut that. We don't need to put carbon price, because by putting it and selling it, it provides an excuse for people not to reduce, because they can compensate. And who can do that? The rich countries, the corporations. And who suffers? The poor countries, because they cannot. You see that we are just reinforcing the imbalance instead of creating a balance that all of us should contribute. And those that are causing the global warming should do more.
Carbon credits can't fully replace cutting emissions and making systemic changes for a low-carbon economy. Joan says they make rich companies or countries more powerful, as only they can afford them. Yet, she also stresses the importance of respecting each community's decisions. Joan believes trusting their knowledge is key to avoiding colonialist practices.
I respect the decision of communities, right? Because I believe that they will take decisions based on their best interest.
For example, when talking about carbon credits, she found that an indigenous community in Canada was using this strategy to protect their territory and self-determination.
Well, I had an exchange with an indigenous leader from Canada, and they are into the carbon market. But they control the price of the carbon market. They may make use of the whatever they gain from the carbon market for continuing to conserve the forest, the boreal forests. And so they are still the ones in control. So they are just using the monetary form to continue what they have been doing, which is protecting the forest. To me, that is an exceptional case.
The bottom line is that indigenous peoples should be integral to decision-making processes, their diverse perspectives respected as experts of their own lands. This is the only way to resist green colonization.
We need to stand together and not allow the divide and rule strategy That's one. Second is that we need to build bridges. We need to collaborate across different with indigenous peoples at the country level, and with also indigenous peoples that are facing the same. So for example, if it's the same company, mining company like Shell, for example, then it's good to link those affected in the Philippines and Ecuador, in Africa. That will strengthen us further because we're speaking in one voice against that company, right? So that's another one. The third is building, generating support from like-minded, from advocates that are willing to stand by us, who are willing to support us, no? But in a respectful way, that we take the lead and they support.
A lifetime of activism, of resistance. Joan has dedicated herself to speaking out against injustice, fighting for human rights and environmental protection. From her college days to organizing major indigenous resistance movements worldwide. Now, at 60 years old, despite the escalating global climate crisis, Joan continues to find hope for a possible future.
I find hope in the young people, and we should never give that up, because I became an activist when I was young. Of course, we need still the elders to guide us, but it's the energy of the young people, their desire to change is important, and I see that now.
While rooting for the youth and the desire to explore new possibilities, Joan always draws inspiration from her people, the knowledge of indigenous peoples, their relationship to the land, and their essential role in guiding humanity towards solutions to face the global climate crisis.
The second hope that I also have is that as indigenous peoples are persisting, we're not giving up. We're not giving up. In spite of the challenges that we face, in spite of the severe discrimination, the exploitation, the killings, the attacks that we experience, we are still standing up.
In spite of it all, the resilience of the indigenous peoples outshines any efforts to oppress them. Joan remains hopeful, especially for the indigenous youth who are bravely stepping forward to advocate for their communities and pave new paths of collaboration towards a hopeful future. A possible future where sustainability and our connection to the land aren't mediated by business, where life for humans and non-humans is at the center of our collective efforts.
An expression that adin bukudan nan gawis, that means don't be selfish of your blessing. So it's always saying, share what you have. Share your blessings. For me, that's a very important value. The generosity, right? Because we are all interdependent. And so we need to share what we have. Because we can only survive as humans if we share what we have with each other. So I want to leave that message.
Crossing the River is a podcast from More Than Human Life Project Moth, based at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU School of Law and 070 Podcast. The production and script were made by me, Goldie Levy. It was edited by Carlos Andrés Vaquero Diaz, who is also the lead researcher of this project, and Natalia Arenas, director of 070. It was commented by Cesar Rodriguez Garavito from NYU ERA. The music is by Cosmo Sheldrake. Thank you to Joan Carling for accepting this interview, for your guidance and hopefulness. And thank you for listening.